Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. Appreciate you taking the time to join me on this beautiful Thursday evening here in New York, in truly the last bastion of freedom. Because as you may or may not know, the way that freedom is defined in New York today is you can commit a crime with impunity and you're let go the next day. You can commit another crime, you're let go the next day. We are now in a no cash bail city. So freedom to commit crimes, if you're a citizen, your freedoms are infringed upon. This is truly the last bastion in de Blasio's New York. As I mentioned, this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. I filled in several times in the past, but if it's your first time listening in, watching on the first, welcome. I'm a fellow at the Claremont Institute, a senior contributor at The Federalist. You can follow all my work at benweingarten.com. Subscribe to my newsletter at bit.ly/BHW News. Tell you a little bit later about my first book, which comes out at the end of February, and this may be an exclusive. First, I'll be talking about this in any great depth. It's sure to be provocative, and I know you're going to appreciate this one. All right, so we're in the midst now of a whole bunch of different major debates over national security and foreign policy, this impeachment charade, which I don't even want to talk about, but I feel we do need to talk about it, not because of the specifics, but because of the broader significance. There's some goings-on in immigration that you're really not hearing about anywhere else that we have to talk about. And then, yesterday, the president just signed the Phase 1 China trade deal. And so today we're going to talk about these topics with what I think are some of the finest minds on these various issues. Coming up just a bit later in this hour, Michael Doran on Iran policy and the Trump Middle East policy more broadly. We'll talk with the great Professor John Eastman about all things immigration, insanity, and some sanity as well. And then last but not least, we'll also talk with Peter Navarro, Dr. Peter Navarro of the Trump administration, one of the so-called hawks on China, to talk about this deal, put it in its greater context, tell us a little bit about some of the details, what are the things we should look for, what's being missed in all the coverage. Because as I've talked about in this program before, China is the greatest threat to our liberty. It is a communist power by definition, and it is not a communist power that is content to just rule its own people with an iron fist. It's hegemonic. It's hegemonic in its ambitions, and not just regionally, but globally. And if a totalitarian power wants to be the dominant world power, necessarily that means it has to shrink our freedom and the freedom of the West more broadly. So we will get to all that and much more today. I want to start with the Democrats standing with Russia and China and Iran. And hear me out on this. And North Korea, too, by the way. If you remember, when Trump was portrayed as the reckless cowboy, before he was portrayed as the naive isolationist, before he was again portrayed as the reckless cowboy when it comes to Iran. Remember, Kim Jong-un was considered the rational actor at the table at one point. But why is it that the Democrats stand with all of these adversaries and point the finger at us and say, we are traitors? That really sticks in my craw, and it should stick in your craw too. Because for the last 100 years, Democrats have been the ones appeasing, bribing, coddling, trying to find moderates in the world's worst regimes. Those regimes that are truly the most anti-social justice, actually just anti-justice, no modifier needed, regimes in the world. And I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of Nancy Pelosi tweeting out things about Moscow Mitch McConnell, and same thing with her friend, I believe one of the impeachment managers, Hakeem Jeffries, congressman from New York. Some congressmen have said that regardless of what happens with impeachment, they're going to continue pursuing Trump-Russia ties and links. You know, the whole premise of the whole Trump-Russia hoax, which was really about trying to take down his presidency through this wedge issue, which, by the way, Hillary Clinton and her team were talking about within 24 hours after she lost, as has been documented and reported at length. It is all about saying this person's a traitor and therefore illegitimate, therefore dangerous, and therefore that justifies us taking the most brazen acts possible to undermine him, even if it means undermining everything else that the country is based on. I've said this repeatedly in articles and on air. You know, who is violating the norms, values, and principles and institutions that they tell us are so essential? It's them. Who is coddling our worst adversaries? It's them. And we have seen some of the most shameful examples of this in light of following the attack that took out Qasem Soleimani, who I always refer to, and I think you should refer to him too, as the world's leading terrorist, of the world's leading terror force, of the world's leading terrorist regime that funds, runs, orchestrates everything that is done by this world's leading sponsor of terror in Iran and its malocracy. And we should separate, by the way, that regime from the people, some percentage of which are actually out there literally risking their lives because they actually do thirst for real, genuine freedom. Not the freedom that we heard about in Egypt, which was freedom for the Muslim Brotherhood to run roughshod over Christians and all sorts of other ethnic minorities and destroy a country. Not the kind of freedom we heard about in all the other Arab Spring places where the Arab Spring turned into the Arab winter very quickly. No, in Iran, there actually is some percentage of the populace who, like in pre-1979, pre-Islamic revolutionary Iran, actually do yearn for something approximating freedom and actually could be an ally and a partner with America and the West more broadly. I want to go to a couple clips because some of the things that those on the left have been saying post-Soleimani are just absolutely insane. And just like with Nancy Pelosi calling Mitch McConnell Moscow Mitch, and by the way, his preferred name is Cocaine Mitch. He said this, so show some respect to the majority leader, Madam Speaker. And when they talk about the whole Russia collusion hoax, you're a traitor, even though it's been disproven, even though it's been proven that this was really Spygate, not Russiagate. Russia was the excuse to spy on an opposing campaign and to weaponize our national security and law enforcement apparatus as part of a long-running campaign from before the man was inaugurated to try to take him down. By the way, before I get to Iran, let me just say, it is the Democrats, it is those who have propagated this Russiagate, Russia collusion narrative, Russia treasonous conspiracy narrative. They are doing far more damage to our country than Vladimir Putin or anyone in Russia could ever hope to do to America. And it's sort of the same thing with what we're seeing with what honestly sound like propagandists for the Iranian malocracy, a malocracy that has been at war with America since 1979. Let's go to clip one. Here's John Kerry talking about Iran.
It's a sad day when the United States of America has to rely on the decision of a regime that we neither like nor trust to have them be the ones who behave somehow in a way that saves Donald Trump from his own decision.
They have the ones saving Donald Trump from his own decision. This is a man who literally admitted that Iran deal, the crown jewel of the Obama administration in their second term, non-treaty, imposed upon the American people, imposed upon the world, which we'll talk about at great length. And we'll talk about why Iran deal isn't actually the proper name for the deal, because that doesn't describe at all what it did. It wasn't an Iran nuclear deal. It was fake arms control, actually about propping up the world's leading state sponsor of jihad. But John Kerry really has some nerve here, because this is a man who himself has admitted, back in 2017, some of the more than $100 billion that we released to Iran, and that is comprised of sanction relief and all the increased trade activity that Iran got when we pulled off all of these sanctions from them. He himself admitted that some of that money, obviously, would end up going towards, you guessed it, jihad. So John Kerry was totally fine with the U.S. becoming the world's leading state sponsor of the world's leading state sponsor of jihad. So who the hell is he to make this kind of comment? Iran's saving him. No, Trump is cleaning up the mess that preceded him in a resolute and a prudent way, in a way that Iran never expected, because we've been bribing them, appeasing them, not calling a spade for decades, and that's under Republicans and Democrats, by the way. All right, I want to go to another clip. Let's go to clip 2, and this is a New York Times reporter, I believe her name is Rukmina Callimachi, applauding Iran. Let's go to clip 2.
The perception of America right now, I would say in the Middle East, is that we act outside the law. I hear this all the time from Iraqis, from Syrians who do not see a legal process behind what we are doing, specifically because of the failure of the Iraq War and the tainted intelligence that led to that point. One of the takeaways of the past week is that we actually saw, in my opinion, Iran act with perhaps more restraint than our own government. The rocket attacks the missiles that landed on the bases where there were American troops did not kill anyone. That seems like a wise decision that they made. Thankfully, our own government has now backed off as well.
Restraint. The Iranian regime is the prudent, sound, wise, beneficent. They didn't act out of restraint. They acted because they knew that if they threatened the life and limb of our soldiers or our assets, threatened to destroy them, that a city in Iran would be leveled. Okay? That has not been clear to the Iranian regime. They never expected that from any administration, including this one. They thought they could tap the Trump administration along, continue to poke and prod. All they've been doing is provocations towards the U.S., our partners, and our allies. Testing, probing, seeing how far could they push before they got any sort of a reaction from America. And what they got was an overwhelming reaction that destabilized an already wobbling regime. So why did the Mulocracy respond the way that they did with their tail between their legs? Because they knew that we pose an existential threat to their existence for the first time in a long time. Certainly since the start of the Obama presidency, and frankly, arguably since probably decades before that. And there's a case to be made that they are on weaker ground today than they've been in at least a decade, and potentially far more. We'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed in this first hour. But I want to point out why it is that the left sides with whoever's an enemy of Trump, and in this case, all of our adversaries. It's not just that they hate Trump. And it's not just that they have this naive worldview that all of our worst enemies can be appeased, or at least that that's the better thing to do than actually confront reality as it is and deal with a complicated world that's full of murderous thugs. That not everyone is by nature necessarily good. That there are people that actually do want to infringe upon our daily life and our freedoms, as we've seen time and time again. And that you don't try to appease a bully because that only emboldens that bully. What the Democrats have done is they have in effect aided, abetted, and enabled all of our worst adversaries. They are the ones who have sowed discord in our politics to an unprecedented level, I mean, certainly relative to the Obama years. They have corrupted our system of checks and balances and separated powers, and everything from impeachment to the way that leftist judges have gone about blocking entire administration policies. One random federal judge, we'll talk about this a little bit later, can stop clearly lawful presidential policies across the entire country. Think about the tyranny of that judicial supremacy. They have violated the individual liberties of Americans in the way that they've gone about the entire Russiagate perpetration and then the cover-up, which has been in part impeachment in some ways, the so-called Mueller special counsel investigation and everything associated with it, the millions of subpoenas that they've issued. They've weaponized our law enforcement mechanism. They've sought to cover up the abuses of the intelligence apparatus and law enforcement, and they've cheered on an administrative state that's tried to sabotage the president, who gives that administrative state its power. All of these rogue officials and all of these agencies that come out and snipe at the president, they only have power because the president's delegated it to them. Democrats cheer this on. Imagine, you can't even imagine, you can't conceive of a scenario because there aren't enough conservatives in the administrative state, and they would never act this inappropriately, of course, in the first place. You can't conceive of a scenario where the Obama administration did something and he was sabotaged by rogue conservatives conspiring within the administrative state. It would never happen. It would be laughed out of the room. Couldn't even be conceived of. They are the ones who are trying to purge all dissenting views from public life, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Anything that dares challenge the progressive orthodoxy, unacceptable. Voices should be shut out. And why? Why do they side with our adversaries, and why do they, in effect, aid, abet, and enable them with their actions while claiming that we're the traitors and we're the ones undermining the institutions? They think that the America that we understand, that we believe in, that we understand the founders to have crafted for us, built for us, they think that America is inherently evil. It's the scourge of the earth. And so if you hate that which is evil, you believe yourself good, then the only way to fix it is to turn it on its head. Repudiate all the principles. Run roughshod over them. Because the ends justify the means for them. And the ends ultimately are power. It's power for them. Sometimes they say this outright. And some of these comments from these reporters and Obama administration officials, praising the Iranians, it reminded me of a New York Times op-ed writer, Thomas Friedman. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He wrote back in September 2009 something that sticks with me. It should stick with you too, and it really represents where the left is. He said, one-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can have great advantages. Beijing wants to make sure that it owns that industries and is ordering policies to do it. From the top down, our one-party democracy, quote unquote, is worse. They want to rule everything because they don't want us to have a voice, because they disagree with this entire experiment, and they'll undermine it any and every which way they can, including siding with our worst adversaries. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We've been talking about the left siding with our worst adversaries and a little bit specifically about Iran. And in my next segment, I'm going to interview someone who is, in my view, one of the finest experts on national security and foreign policy, generally in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. I think he's written some of the most prescient, deep, probing, insightful pieces on not only what the strike on Soleimani means for American national security and foreign policy, but also what it means in context of U.S. Middle East policy more broadly and where the Trump administration stands on it. Because a lot of people, frankly, are hysterical when it comes to anything the Trump administration does, but in particular do not understand that there actually is a coherent method to all that we've been doing from the Middle East to China to Western and Eastern Europe and beyond, Russia as well. And so we're going to talk with Michael Duran of the Hudson Institute about a number of these topics. He actually, I'll tease this a little bit, has floated that the Obama administration, as I understand it, may have written love letters to Qasem Soleimani. And I talk in jest here, but actually did communicate directly, potentially, with Soleimani, and not to deliver the kind of message that the Trump administration did, which is knock it off or else. We'll talk about that right after this. Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we have on the line right now, as I just mentioned, what I think is one of the finest scholars when it comes to national security and foreign policy in the Middle East in general, and Iran in particular. Mike Duran, he's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He formerly held positions in both the Department of Defense and on the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Ben, and thanks for that very generous introduction.
Well, it's well-deserved, and been a long-time fan of your work, and we've discussed many of these issues at length. And I thought Buck's audience deserves to hear from someone who was in a policy-making position, who has grappled with the adversaries that we're dealing with today. And in particular, I wanted to start with something that you sort of teased out on Twitter and was later corroborated by Lee Smith, another great writer on national security and foreign policy we've had on the program before, where you discussed the fact that a little birdie told you, essentially, that the Obama administration had drafted some letters to the world's leading terrorist of the world's leading terror force, the Quds force of the world's leading terror regime, the Iranian malocracy. What else can you tell us about that?
Well, actually, I don't know much more than that. It was absolutely a little birdie. Somebody who I happen to know and who I happen to know is in a position to know this fact firsthand, said, "Hey, did you know that under the Obama administration, we sent letters, plural, to Qasem Soleimani?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that, and it's very interesting." And so I put that out on Twitter. So I pretended to be I joked that I was an anonymous whistleblower. The joke being that everyone in Washington, D.C. knows that Eric Jaramella is the anonymous whistleblower on the Zelensky conversation that Trump is being impeached over. And he's been walking around town all since this thing began, and you're not allowed, supposedly, you're not allowed to say his name. If you write his name on Twitter, you get deplatformed and so on. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'd like to be an anonymous whistleblower too. People, you get to walk into restaurants and people point at you and say, "Hey, there's the anonymous whistleblower." So I'm anonymous here. I'm not. When I talk to you about the letters to Soleimani, I'm not Mike Duran at the Hudson Institute. I'm anonymous. Okay, I'll neither confirm nor deny that I'm Mike Duran as long as we're talking about this.
We'll make sure not to leak your name to the Washington Post and the Times. And I think it is significant, though, to the extent they did write letters to Soleimani, and it's eminently believable because the Obama administration took sanctions off of Soleimani as part of the so-called Iran nuclear deal in the first place. But it's quite an interesting contrast that they were probably writing letters hoping to come to some sort of agreement or accord with Soleimani, whereas the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, drafted a letter to Soleimani, which basically said, knock off the malign activities or else. And the or else actually happened.
Exactly. I mean, let's start with the last point first. The letter that Pompeo sent to Soleimani actually he did so on the instructions of Donald Trump. I know this for a fact as well. Trump saw something in the intelligence early on in the administration that worried him. And he said, "I see that this guy Soleimani is organizing to kill Americans. I want to send him a letter, and I want to put him on notice that if he harms a hair on a single American, that there will be immediate and drastic consequences." And I don't know how the decision was made. I guess maybe his advisor said, "Actually, Mr. President, I don't think you should be the one talking to Soleimani." So it fell to Pompeo, and Pompeo's letter was very short and very sweet, and it basically said, I don't know the exact wording, but it basically said just what I said. If you harm the hair on one American, there will be hell to pay. And that's the origin. That's the origin of the attack on Soleimani. I mean, he was warned, and he was warned time and again, and he ignored it, and he paid a price for it. That's the way it should be.
Soleimani is portrayed, and I think accurately so, as sort of the architect of, really, in some sense, the Shiite crescent and Iran's jihadist activities around the world, and also obviously has the blood of hundreds of Americans on his hands and orchestrated the attack on our embassy, which is an act of war, and according to the administration, was planning on orchestrating other ones as well. How significant is the fact that Soleimani no longer walks the face of the earth from the perspective of destabilizing the Iranian malocracy?
Oh, it's enormously significant. This is the single most important thing the United States has done in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq. There's no doubt about it. First of all, let's just start with him as an individual. When the CIA looks at whether to eliminate an individual, one of the things they ask is, can he be easily replaced? So is it going to be just whack-a-mole? We get rid of this guy, is another one going to pop up? And in the case of Soleimani, he was absolutely unique, absolutely indispensable. You can almost never say that about somebody, that they are indispensable. But he's been in that job for years. He was responsible for Iran's policy toward the entire Arab world. He's the de facto head of special forces, head of the CIA. I mean, if we were to map him onto onto the American system, he would be the head of Special Forces, the head of CIA, the head of USAID, and the head of the State Department with regard to all of the Arab world and beyond, Afghanistan as well. Javad Zarif is not the real foreign minister. He's the errand boy of Qasem Soleimani. Now, he's lieutenant general. He's the head of the Quds force of the IRGC. So on the org chart, the head of the IRGC was his commanding officer, but that was not the case. He was an independent force. He had a direct line to the supreme leader. He was the architect of this policy of creating militias across the Arab world and then distributing to those militias precision-guided weaponry, completely with the goal of undermining the U.S. order in the region by undermining America's allies. And he was also putting a noose around the neck of Israel. So getting rid of him was just in that respect was fantastic. But if I can have a second, I'll add a couple of other reasons why this was important.
Go ahead.
So number two, Trump has totally changed the game. Up until now, for the last three presidents, when we have dealt with Iran, we have always played the game on Iran's terms. That is that we know that Iran was building these militias, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the 5 or 6 major militias they've got in Iraq, and so on, and that those militias are taking orders from Tehran. But when those militias would misbehave, we would always respond weakly against the militias as if we didn't know that Tehran was actually pulling the strings. Trump has said, I'm not playing that game anymore. I'm not going to play this game on your terms. I know you're in charge, and I'm going to hold you responsible for what you're doing. That's a strategic shift by U.S. policy. And it's amazing the effect it has had in a very short period of time, because now all of a sudden Trump has cut Iran down to size. Iran is not as powerful as the United States, and yet we've been treating it like an equal. You know, John Kerry sat in Vienna week after week after week opposite Zarif like they were like we were equal powers. And Trump has shown, no, actually, you're a small, weak power, and we are a superpower. And if you bite our ankles too hard, we're going to kick you in the teeth, which is exactly what he did. And everyone in the region sees that, and they're all reacting to it. So we have reinvigoration of the protests in Iran, of the anti-Iranian protests in Iraq, and of the protests in Lebanon, among other things. I mean, everyone in the region immediately felt that the balance of power shifted towards the United States. And if I could just make one last point,
yes.
I'll make it very briefly. We also took out in that attack on Soleimani a number of other individuals, but one really particularly stands out, and that's al-Muhandis, who was Iran's number one guy in Iraq. Simply taking out Muhandis would have been a very big deal. And he's kind of been forgotten in the discussion of this because Soleimani was so huge. But the effect of this for the U.S. relations with Iraq are huge.
So, you know, you mentioned one point that I want to kind of hone in on, which is the why. You said the last three administrations have effectively looked the other way, been willfully blind, refused to poke the bear when it comes to Iran. And I think arguably, and you'd probably agree, really this dates back to both Carter and Reagan, actually. How do you explain the fact that for all this time we've been so engaged in the Middle East, in all of these sectarian squabbles? How is it that Iran has gotten off scot-free the entire time? What is the explanation within our national security and foreign policy establishment for why we've pursued the path that we have?
Yeah, you know, the simple answer is America has a fantasy of returning with the Islamic Republic, of returning to the relationship it had under the Shah. And it has been telling itself since Reagan, you're 100% correct about that. Since Reagan, it's been telling itself that Iran is going to moderate. It's going to become a normal country. Under the Islamic Republic, is going to become a normal country just looking after its interests, and we can come to an accommodation with it. That was the whole thesis behind Reagan's arms for hostages. That we were looking, the arms. You know, Reagan famously went on the on primetime television and told the American people, a couple of months ago, I told you, American people, that I did not trade arms for hostages. He said my intentions and my gut, or I can't remember the exact words, but I still I still feel like I didn't do that, but I've looked at the facts, and this is what happened. And at the time, I was a student, and I heard Reagan say this, and I thought, how could you not know? But actually, it was true. He didn't know that he had done that, because the goal of sending the arms to the Iranians was during the Iran-Iraq War, and their military was was all American equipment, and they needed spare parts. The goal was not to give them spare parts. The goal was to use the delivery of the spare parts to find the moderates in Tehran with whom we could talk, so we could get back to the old relationship that we used to have. So this is a bipartisan American dream. It's stronger today on the left than it is on the right, but you can find it in the Republican sphere as well. And it is the source of these letters that I believe we won't know until they're declassified, if they ever will be. But that's the source of the letters that I believe, I presume, that the Obama administration sent to Soleimani. The Obama administration believed that that the U.S. and Iran shared a couple of key vital interests. One was the stability of Iraq, and two was fighting ISIS. I don't need to go into details. I don't agree with either of those presumptions, but they're very deep in the foreign policy establishment, that we have overlapping interests with Iran, and if we just show the Iranians that we're not hostile to them, then we can unlock the potential for cooperation that these shared interests represent.
This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We'll be back with Mike Duran just after this. We've been talking about the sea change that has transpired, not just with Iran, but with the Middle East. Frankly, it's definitely heard by the North Koreans. I'm sure it's heard in Beijing as well. A couple sort of fundamental questions. One, how weak is the Iranian regime today? And to the extent it was to fall tomorrow, do you believe the Trump administration has devised contingency plans so that America's national interest is best served should that happen?
I don't know how weak it is. The simple answer is I don't know. I'm very reluctant to say that a regime is going to fall. I watched the Syrian regime very closely, and everyone predicted that it was going to fall weeks, months, whatever, and it never did. And of course, the Russians stepped in to help it. If it looked like Tehran was really about to collapse completely, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw the Chinese and the Russians get involved. We may not. It's clearly, and the one thing you can say for sure is that it has a legitimacy crisis of the likes of which it has never seen before. The vast majority of Iranians do not regard it, do not really support it, but it has, this coercive apparatus that people, it's willing to shoot people who want to topple it. And some significant percentage of the population feels that their livelihood, if not their lives, are bound up in the continuation of the regime. So I don't know how long can it limp along like this. I'm really not sure. Does the U.S. have contingency plans? I would, you never know, but I would doubt it, just because I don't think the Trump administration was thinking, it hasn't had its goal has not been to topple the regime. Its goal has been to weaken the regime in order to get a deal, particularly over the nuclear question. But by just a little bit of, strategic application of American force, Trump has shown the regime to be weaker than I think most people thought it was. And so now all of a sudden we have this question about, well, what if it goes? I doubt anyone's thought that through.
To those who say that China is the biggest threat of all, which I agree with, by the way, Iran is a threat. China is the greatest nation state threat to American liberty. And they say, well, what is really our interest in the Middle East when you have this massive power that's looming? What is your best argument to them that, no, we actually do have an interest in the Middle East in general, in an Iran situation that is in America's national interest in particular, given the sort of greater challenges that loom over the short, medium, and long term?
I think it's all about China, actually. What's gonna happen if we're not careful is that China is going to come in and become the primary supporter, or maybe China and Russia together, of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime's immediate goal is to drive the United States out of the Persian Gulf and to take over control, not necessarily absolute ownership, but control of the vast oil resources of the Gulf. That's what it wants. The target of the Iranians is Saudi Arabia. They want to take over they want to control the oil resources of the Gulf, and then the Iranians themselves see themselves as the leaders of the Islamic world. They want to take over the holy sites in Saudi Arabia. Now, if China and its ally Iran, if they were to ally together, or Russia, China, and Iran as a bloc, then and control the oil resources of the Gulf, then they control the oil resources of Europe, and they'll start using that privileged position as the main provider of oil to Europe to start weakening the U.S.-European bond, and we would have one dominant power on the Eurasian landmass, China. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid China just completely owning all of Eurasia. That's not good for democracy in America.
We've been speaking with Mike Duran, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and I think one of the finest minds when it comes to U.S. national security and foreign policy. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. And this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. We're back right after this.